Close your eyes and picture North America. What do you see? Vast, empty wilderness, untamed forests waiting to be discovered. For centuries, that's the story we were told. But the truth is far more incredible. Long before a single European ship touched its shores, this land was a bustling continent, a mosaic of vibrant civilizations. Imagine, if you will, the year 1008. In the heartland of what is now Illinois, a city rises from the earth, not of stone, but of soil. This is Cahokia, the crown jewel of the Mississippian culture. Its population rivals that of London at the time. A massive central mound, larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza at its base, dominates the skyline, surrounded by plazas, temples, and thousands of homes. This wasn't just a settlement. It was a metropolis, the center of a sprawling network of trade and influence. Further north, nestled among the great forests and lakes, the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, established a groundbreaking political system. 5 distinct nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca banded together to form a great league of peace. Their constitution, passed down orally for generations, inspired the very founders of the United States with its principles of representative government, individual liberty, and checks and balances. This was a sophisticated democracy flourishing in the woodlands of the Northeast. Out on the windswept Great Plains, life moved to the rhythm of the earth. Nomadic nations followed the immense herds of bison, their entire existence intertwined with this magnificent animal. The bison provided everything: food, shelter from its hides, tools from its bones, and a spiritual anchor for their culture. They were master horsemen, long before the Spanish introduced the horsehand. Their deep understanding of the environment allowed them to thrive in a land of extremes, and connecting them all, a vast web of trade routes, the arteries of the continent. Conch shells from the Gulf of Mexico were found in the Great Lakes. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains was traded to the Ohio Valley, and copper from the shores of Lake Superior made its way to the Deep South. Along with these goods traveled ideas, stories, and innovations. This wasn't a silent continent. It was a land alive with commerce, diplomacy, and culture. From the cliff dwellers of the Southwest, with their intricate astronomical observatories, to the salmon fishing communities of the Pacific Northwest, with their towering totem poles, hundreds of unique nations had built worlds upon millennia of accumulated knowledge. But across the vast Atlantic, a different world was stirring. In Scandinavia, Norse sagas spoke of lands to the west, whispered tales from sailors who had been blown off course. Around the year 1000, a Viking explorer named Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, decided to see for himself. He sailed from Greenland, following the stories, and landed on the shores of what is now Newfoundland, Canada. There, at a site we now call Lonceau Meadows, his crew built a small settlement, a handful of longhouses made of turf and timber. This was it. The first documented European presence in the Americas. A brief, fleeting moment of contact. But it didn't last. Relations with the local indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skrallings, were tense, and the settlement was too far from their Greenlandic homeland to be sustainable. Within a few years, the Vikings were gone. They packed up and sailed away, leaving behind only the ghosts of their buildings and a few scattered artifacts. And then, silence. The connection was broken. The memory faded into myth. For nearly 500 years, Europe forgot about the continent across the ocean. The civilizations of North America continued to grow, trade, and evolve, unaware of the brief visitors who had come and gone. They lived in their world, a world rich with history and tradition, while across the sea, kingdoms rose and fell, hungry for new routes, new wealth, and new glory. The stage was set, a world held in a delicate balance, unknowingly waiting for the moment when the sails would reappear on the horizon. This time, not for a fleeting visit, but for conquest. Imagine, for a moment, a world where half the planet didn't know the other half existed. A world where maps ended in monstrous voids and the ocean was a terrifying, infinite unknown. This was Europe at the end of the 15th century. The ancient trade routes to the east, the source of silk, spices, and untold riches, were collapsing. The dream of reaching the fabled Indies, described by Marco Polo, was fading. But in the salty air of Europe's ports, a new audacious idea was taking root. What if, instead of going east, one could sail west, straight into the sunset? The tools were there, the compass, the astrolabe, the ambition was burning. In Portugal, Prince Henry the Navigator was already sending ships down the coast of Africa, chipping away at the edges of the map. But one man, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, had a bolder vision. He was obsessed with the idea that Asia was just a few weeks' sail across the Atlantic. After years of rejection, he finally found his patrons in King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. They gave him 3 small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria Letters. In August 1492, they set sail. Weeks turned into an eternity of open water. The crew, terrified and on the verge of mutiny, begged to turn back. Columbus, driven by a faith that bordered on madness, held the course. Then, on October 12th, a cry pierced the pre-dawn darkness. Tierra, tierra, land. Columbus believed he had reached the outskirts of Asia. He hadn't. He had stumbled upon the Bahamas, a gateway to an entire hemisphere unknown to Europe. To his dying day, he never grasped the true scale of his discovery. The news hit Europe like a tidal wave. The map of the world was shattered and redrawn overnight. Suddenly, a new world existed, a name given to the continents by another explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, whose own name would be immortalized as America. Spain, hungry for gold and glory, unleashed its conquistadors. Hernan Cortes toppled the Aztec Empire. Francisco Pizarro crushed the Inca. Ships heavy with silver and sugar crossed the Atlantic, making Spain the most powerful nation on earth, but at a terrible cost for the native peoples. This wasn't an empty land. It was home to ancient civilizations and millions of people. For them, the arrival of Europeans was a catastrophe. Diseases like smallpox and measles, to which they had no immunity, swept through their populations, wiping out entire societies before a single battle was fought. While Spain conquered the south, other nations looked north. France sent Jacques Cartier up the St. Lawrence River, and England's John Cabot claimed the rocky coasts of Newfoundland. The Pope tried to divide the new lands between Spain and Portugal, but it was no use. The race for empire had begun. This era wasn't just about conquest, it was about connection. For the first time, the fates of every continent became intertwined. Oceans transformed from barriers into highways for trade, ideas, and war. The flood of wealth from the Americas remade Europe's economies, fueling conflicts and building magnificent cities. The world felt smaller, knowable, and ready to be mastered. The age of exploration was morphing into the age of empire. By the early 1600s, the Atlantic was bustling with ships carrying settlers, soldiers, and the seeds of new nations. The "Here be dragons" on old maps was replaced with the names of colonies and coastlines. The discovery was over. The conquest was in full swing. The 3 small ships that sailed in 1492 had unleashed a chain of events that would forge the modern world through centuries of conflict and creation. The age of discovery had closed its chapter, but the age of colonies was just beginning. Following Columbus, the discovery of the New World ignited a firestorm of ambition across Europe. Within a century, this vast unknown land became the most coveted prize on earth. Every major power, Spain, France, England, Portugal, and the Netherlands, raced to carve out their piece of the pie. But conquest was just the beginning. To build an empire, they needed settlement, survival, and sheer endurance. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, this new age brought upheaval and devastation. For the Europeans, it was an age of both dreams and nightmares. The promise of land, wealth, and freedom lured thousands across the sea, but most found only hardship and uncertainty. In the early 1500s, Spain was the undisputed superpower. Its empire stretched from the Caribbean deep into South America, fueled by rivers of silver from the mines of Patriotic and Zacatecas. Spanish galleons, laden with unimaginable riches, sailed back to Europe, constantly hunted by pirates. The Spanish crown established grand imperial centers like Mexico City and Lima. But the lands to the north remained untamed. Florida was their first target. In 1565, they founded St. Augustine, the oldest European settlement in North America. But the land was harsh, and native tribes fought back fiercely. Despite the cost, the Spanish Empire pushed on, establishing missions across the southwest, spreading Catholicism with both faith and fire. Meanwhile, other European powers watched with envy, ready to challenge Spain's dominance. The French, driven by commerce, sent explorers north. Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River, claiming vast territories for France. He didn't find gold, but he opened the door to a new kind of empire, one built on fur. By the early 1600s, French traders and missionaries ventured deep into the continent, forging alliances with native tribes like the Huron and Algonquin. Quebec, founded in 1608, became the heart of New France, an empire that was sparse in settlement but vast in influence. Stretching all the way down the Mississippi River, the English were slower to act but just as ambitious. Their first attempt, the Roanoke colony in 1587, vanished without a trace, becoming a haunting mystery known as the Lost Colony. But England didn't give up. In 1607, 3 small ships arrived in the Chesapeake Bay and established Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement. It was a brutal beginning. Disease and famine wiped out 2/3 of the settlers in the first winter. Yet, against all odds, Jamestown survived. Thanks to Captain John Smith's strict leadership and a fragile peace with the Powhatan Confederacy. Then, a new crop changed everything. Tobacco. John Rolfe cultivated a sweeter strain that became wildly popular in England. This brown gold transformed Virginia's fortunes overnight. Tobacco plantations spread, and with them came a dark new chapter. Slavery. In 1619, the first recorded Africans arrived in Virginia. Initially treated as indentured servants, they were soon forced into lifelong slavery, laying the foundation for a plantation economy and a deep moral contradiction. To the north, a different kind of colony emerged. In 1620, the Pilgrims, seeking religious freedom, landed in Massachusetts and founded Plymouth. They endured a brutal first winter, but with help from the Wampanoag people and a man named Squanto, they survived. Their shared harvest in 1621 became the first Thanksgiving, a fleeting moment of peace. Over the decades, English colonies multiplied. New England was built on religious zeal. The middle colonies, like New York, thrived on trade and tolerance, and the southern colonies grew rich from plantations powered by enslaved labor. The Dutch also made their mark, founding the bustling port of New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island in 1625. But in 1664, English warships forced them to surrender, and New Amsterdam became New York. By the late 1600s, North America was a mosaic of cultures and ambitions. It was no longer a frontier. It was a battleground of faith, wealth, and survival. But far from the reach of European kings, something new was taking root in the English colonies, a spirit of self-reliance and independence. The age of colonies was an age of contradictions, of freedom sought and freedom denied. Empires had planted their flags, but they had also unintentionally sown the seeds of a new nation that would one day challenge the very idea of empire itself. The 17th century dawned on a new world divided not just by geography, but by faith, ambition, and the raw struggle for survival. The colonies, once fragile outposts, were now thriving footholds of empire. Yet, beneath their steady growth, tension simmered among settlers, between nations, and deep within the human spirit itself. This was an age defined not by the clash of swords alone, but by the war for the soul of a continent. Religion was the heartbeat of colonial life, a guiding light for some, a weapon for others. The Puritans of New England had crossed an ocean seeking freedom from persecution, only to build societies bound by rigid doctrine. In towns like Boston and Plymouth, life revolved around scripture and the fear of sin. Churches ruled as both spiritual and civil authorities, and ministers thundered from pulpits, warning of divine wrath. For these settlers, survival in the wilderness was not just a physical battle, it was a test of faith. Yet faith, like fire, could both warm and consume. In 1692, the quiet Puritan village of Salem was engulfed by hysteria. A group of young girls accused their neighbors of witchcraft. What began as whispers spread like a contagion, and soon the town was paralyzed by fear. By the time it ended, 20 people had been executed. The Salem witch trials became a grim reflection of how deeply belief and terror could intertwine. But not all faith led to fanaticism. In Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, tolerance became law. Here, Quakers, Mennonites, Lutherans, and Jews found refuge, creating a living experiment in coexistence. Beyond the church walls, another conflict brewed, one born of land and survival. The expanding colonies pushed deeper into native territories, shattering fragile alliances. In 1675, this resentment ignited. Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, united several native nations against the New England colonies. What followed was one of the bloodiest wars in American history. Villages burned, crops were destroyed, and thousands on both sides perished. Though the colonists ultimately prevailed, the war left New England scarred, and the native tribes decimated, their lands seized, and their autonomy destroyed. While blood was spilled in the forests, rivalries festered across the Atlantic. England began to assert tighter control over its colonies, imposing taxes and trade restrictions. The dream of freedom was slowly being chained to the throne. In Virginia, resentment flared into Bacon's Rebellion, as frontiersmen burned the capital of Jamestown to protest the governor's corruption. Though crushed, the revolt revealed a dangerous truth. The people were beginning to challenge authority. As the century progressed, the colonies matured. Yet with prosperity came division. The gap between rich and poor widened, and the practice of slavery became deeply entrenched, especially in the South. The Atlantic slave trade turned human lives into currency, binding continents in a web of greed and suffering. Still, even in this moral darkness, a spark of liberty flickered. Through town meetings and local assemblies, colonists were learning to govern themselves, to question power, and to define their own destinies. Then, a spiritual revolution swept through the land, the Great Awakening. Traveling preachers denounced established churches and spoke of a personal, direct connection to God. This revolution of belief would prepare minds for the political revolution still to come. By the end of the 17th century, the New World was a place of stark contrasts. Devout communities existed alongside bustling trade cities. A wild, untamed frontier lay just beyond the coast. This was the crucible of America's identity, born from conflict, shaped by faith, and tempered by the relentless will to endure. The colonies were growing stronger, wealthier, and more confident. And though they still called themselves Englishmen, their hearts were beginning to beat to a different rhythm, one that would soon thunder across the world. The age of blood and belief had forged their character in fire. The next age, the clash of empires, would test their destiny. The dawn of the 18th century saw North America as a giant chessboard, carved up by the ambitions of distant empires. To the north, and deep into the continent's heartland, the French flag flew over Canada and the vast Mississippi Valley. To the south and west, Spain held sway over Florida, Texas, and the sun-scorched deserts beyond the Rio Grande, and pressed against the Atlantic coast was a chain of prosperous, restless British colonies. Between these giants lay an endless wilderness, a land of rivers and forests, home to native nations who had mastered the dangerous dance of diplomacy with the European powers. The British colonies were growing richer and stronger than anyone in London could have imagined. Ports like Boston, New York, and Charleston buzzed with activity. Ships heavy with tobacco, timber, and furs crossed the ocean daily. But this prosperity came at a price. Every shipment tightened the golden leash, binding them to British markets and London's laws. The colonists had built their own towns, schools, and governments. But their fate was still decided in a land thousands of miles away. For the European empires, North America was a prize to be won. But this wasn't Europe. The battlefield was untamed, unpredictable, and vast. Control here depended not just on armies, but on alliances with the indigenous nations who knew every secret of the land. The Iroquois Confederacy, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Huron, they were not pawns, but powerful players, trading, fighting, and negotiating to preserve their people amid the clash of empires. It was in this fragile peace that the embers of a global conflict began to glow. Europe's ancient rivalries were about to spill across the Atlantic and set the New World ablaze. For decades, the frontiers smoldered with small-scale conflicts. Skirmishes over fur routes, raids on isolated settlements, and ambushes along the rivers of the Ohio Valley became a brutal fact of life. These weren't wars of grand armies, but of shadows and survival. The French and their native allies moved like ghosts through the forests, striking fast and vanishing. The British, with their fortified towns, tried to claim and hold the land, inch by painful inch. Neither side could win, but both refused to lose. The first major eruption came in 1689. A war in Europe, known as the 9 Years' War, spilled over into the colonies, where it was called King William's War. It set a terrifying precedent: brutal raids, burning villages, and no mercy. French and native war parties descended on New England settlements in the dead of night. The English retaliated with equal ferocity, torching French outposts. When the war ended, nothing had changed, except the hatred between neighbors had grown deeper and more bitter. Less than a decade later, the flames roared back to life in Queen Anne's War. From 1702 to 1713, the colonies were again pawns in a European power struggle. Battles raged from the Carolinas to Newfoundland. The British captured the French fortress of Port Royal, but peace was just an illusion. The wilderness still seethed with violence. Then came King George's War, from 1744 to 1748. This time, colonial militias shocked the world. In a stunning display of courage, New England troops captured the mighty French fortress of Louisbourg. But their victory was snatched away. In the peace treaty, Britain traded the fortress back to France, enraging the colonists who had bled for it. The message was clear. Their sacrifices meant little to their distant king. With each war, the colonists became more capable, more self-reliant. They learned to fight in the wilderness, and began to see themselves not as mere subjects, but as a people apart, forged by the frontier into something new. But the ultimate struggle was yet to come. In the rich Ohio Valley, French and British ambitions were on a final collision course. France began building a chain of forts to cut off British expansion westward. The British pushed their settlers into the same territory, defying both the French and the native tribes. The tension was about to snap. In 1754, a 22-year-old Virginia militia officer named George Washington led a small force into the wilderness to challenge French authority. A chaotic skirmish in the woods near Fort Duquesne resulted in the death of a French officer. This small, bloody incident would ignite a global war known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, and in America as the French and Indian War. For the colonists, it was a fight for survival. For the British, a battle for empire. And for the native nations, it was a desperate struggle to endure as their world collapsed around them. The drums of war were beating, and the age of fragile peace was over. The year is 1754. Deep in the forests of the Ohio Valley, a small skirmish erupts. On one side, a young George Washington and his Virginia militia. On the other, a French patrol. This single spark ignites a fire that will set the entire world ablaze. What began as a frontier clash over trade and territory soon explodes into a global struggle, war stretching from the Americas to Europe, Africa, and even the Philippines. It was a conflict of kings and empires, but on the ground, it was fought by farmers, trappers, and native warriors in the dense, untamed wilderness of a continent. For the British colonies, this war would be a trial by fire, shaping their identity and their destiny. For France, it would be a last, desperate attempt to hold its vast North American empire. And for the native nations caught in the middle, it would be a fight for their very survival. The French and Indian War, named for France and its native allies, was unlike any conflict Europeans had ever fought. Battles weren't waged on open fields, but in forests so thick you could barely see a few yards ahead. Muskets cracked through fog and trees. Ambushes replaced orderly formations. Survival meant knowing the land, and few knew it better than the indigenous warriors who fought alongside both sides. The French, with fewer settlers but stronger alliances, understood this. They built a network of forts and trade routes, sustained by relationships with tribes like the Huron and Algonquin. Their presence was light, their power built on diplomacy. The British, on the other hand, numbered in the millions farmers and merchants pushing relentlessly westward. To the French, they were an encroaching tide. To the native peoples, they were an unstoppable storm. When the first shots were fired, France seemed to have the upper hand. Their soldiers, the legendary coureurs de bois, fought with stealth and precision. The British regulars, trained for European warfare, were completely unprepared. In 1755, General Edward Braddock led 2,000 British troops into the wilderness to seize the strategic Fort Duquesne. Among his officers was a 23-year-old George Washington, eager for glory. The campaign was a disaster. As the column advanced through the woods, they were ambushed by a combined force of French and native warriors. The red-coated British troops, unable to form ranks, were slaughtered. Braddock was mortally wounded, his army routed. Washington barely escaped with his life. The defeat sent shockwaves through the colonies. The myth of British invincibility was shattered. As the war spread, the colonies were drawn deeper into the struggle. From Nova Scotia to the Carolinas, frontiers burned. French and native raids left villages in ashes. In upstate New York, the British and French fought for control of the Hudson Valley and the Great Lakes, the key arteries of the continent. Forts like Ticonderoga became symbols of a bloody stalemate. At sea, Britain's powerful navy began to choke off French supply lines. But on land, France's network of alliances kept it alive. The mighty Iroquois Confederacy, long masters of diplomacy, shrewdly stayed neutral. Watching as the two European powers bled each other dry, the tide began to turn in 1757. Britain's new Prime Minister, William Pitt, poured money, troops, and naval power into the war, declaring that North America would decide the fate of the world. British generals, once arrogant, began to adapt, learning from their failures. Colonial militias were trained, and the British war machine began to move with purpose. In 1758, British forces captured Fort Duquesne, renaming it Fort Pitt, the future site of Pittsburgh. Then, in 1759, came the decisive campaign, the assault on Quebec. Perched high on the cliffs of the St. Lawrence River, Quebec was the heart of New France. For months, British General James Wolfe besieged the city, while the French General Montcalm defended it with tenacity. The stalemate seemed endless until, on a cold September night, Wolfe made his daring move. Under the cover of darkness, his troops scaled the cliffs and formed ranks on the Plains of Abraham, just outside the city walls. At dawn, the two armies met in a brief, brutal clash. Both commanders fell. Wolfe, mortally wounded, Montcalm struck down as his lines broke. Within hours, Quebec fell. The following year, Montreal surrendered. The French Empire in North America had collapsed. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war. The map of the continent was redrawn. France ceded all of its territory east of the Mississippi to Britain. The British Empire now controlled nearly all of North America, but victory came at a staggering cost. The war had left Britain deeply in debt, and the colonies restless. Colonists had fought and suffered, yet they were treated not as partners, but as subordinates. The British government stationed troops and imposed new taxes to pay for the war acts that would ignite a fire of resentment. The native nations, betrayed by their allies, faced an uncertain future. An Ottawa leader named Pontiac united tribes in a rebellion against British forts, but it was ultimately crushed. The message was clear. The age of indigenous power in the East was ending. The French and Indian War reshaped the world. It gave Britain an empire, but it also taught the colonies a dangerous lesson that they could stand on their own. The echoes of musket fire in the Ohio Valley would linger in the minds of men who had fought and bled for a cause that was not their own. And soon, those same men would raise their muskets again, not against France, but against the very empire they had just helped to build. The war for empire was over. The war for independence was about to begin. The cannons of the French and Indian War had fallen silent. But in the colonies, a different kind of storm was gathering. Britain, triumphant and mighty, now faced a new challenge. Not an enemy across the ocean, but the growing unrest within its own American family. The war that had united them against France now left them divided by suspicion and a bitter sense of betrayal. The frontier, once a distant edge of the empire, was now the heart of a restless new world. In London, the war's staggering cost, over £130 million, demanded action. To pay the debt and manage its vast new territories, Parliament turned its eyes to the colonies. For generations, American settlers had enjoyed a unique degree of freedom, electing their own assemblies and levying their own taxes, but that was about to change. Britain decided the colonies would pay their share, not just for the war they'd fought, but for the empire's continued protection. The first blow landed in 1763, King George III's proclamation line, forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, reserving that vast frontier for native tribes. To the colonists who had fought and bled for that very land, it felt like a slap in the face. "They mean to pen us up," one settler fumed, "like sheep upon the mountains." Then came the taxes. The Sugar Act of 1764, followed by the Stamp Act of 1765, which placed a direct tax on everything from legal documents to newspapers. This wasn't about regulating trade. This was about raising revenue, and for the first time, Parliament was taxing the colonies directly, without their consent. The reaction was swift and fierce. Across the 13 colonies, a single cry rose from the streets: "No taxation without representation." Protests erupted. Secret societies, known as the Sons of Liberty, led by fiery patriots like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry, organized boycotts of British goods. Effigies of tax collectors were hung in town squares. Taverns buzzed with revolutionary talk. The colonies were awakening. Bowing to the pressure, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act but issued the Declaratory Act, asserting its absolute power to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The message was clear. London was still in charge. But the flame of resistance, once lit, could not be so easily extinguished. When new taxes on glass, tea, and paper were introduced, defiance grew stronger. Red-coated British soldiers were sent to Boston to keep order, but their presence only made things worse. They weren't seen as protectors, but as occupiers. The tension finally snapped on a cold March night in 1770. A crowd of angry colonists confronted a British sentry, and the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Snowballs turned to stones, shouts to chaos. The soldiers opened fire. When the smoke cleared, 5 men lay dead in the snow, including Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent who would become the first martyr of the Revolution. The Boston Massacre sent shockwaves through the colonies. The bond between Britain and America was bleeding out on the cobblestone streets. In 1773, Parliament made one final, fatal miscalculation. The Tea Act granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales, undercutting local merchants and enforcing a hidden tax. It was the final straw. That December, under the cover of darkness, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor. They worked silently and with discipline, breaking open 342 chests of tea and dumping them into the icy water. The Boston Tea Party was not a riot. It was a powerful, symbolic act of defiance. London's response was furious and absolute. The coercive acts, or, as the Americans called them, the intolerable acts, closed Boston's port, dissolved its government, and placed the colony under direct military rule. But, instead of crushing the rebellion, this heavy-handed punishment united the colonies as never before. They rallied to Boston's defense, and in September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered for the First Continental Congress. They were farmers, lawyers, and merchants, but they were united by a single, powerful idea. Their rights as free men were not up for negotiation. As winter fell, the air grew thick with anticipation. Across the countryside, militias began to drill, calling themselves Minutemen, ready to fight at a moment's notice. The storm finally broke in the spring of 1775. British troops marched from Boston to seize colonial weapons at Concord. But Paul Revere and other riders galloped through the night, their warning echoing from town to town. The British are coming. At dawn, on the village green at Lexington, the redcoats faced a small line of armed colonists. A single shot rang out, the shot heard round the world. No one knows who fired it, but in that instant everything changed. 8 colonists fell, but as the British marched on to Concord, they were met by a swarm of Minutemen firing from behind every tree and stone wall. The professional soldiers were forced into a bloody retreat back to Boston. The war for America's soul had begun. It started not on a grand battlefield, but on a village green, fought by farmers defending their homes and their liberty. In London, they still believed they could crush this uprising, but in America, people were beginning to speak of something far greater than protest. They were speaking of independence, and of a new nation, yet to be born. There was no turning back. By 1773, the British Empire seemed invincible. But, in its American colonies, a quiet fire of unrest was growing. What started as arguments over taxes had become a challenge to the crown itself. The colonies were no longer just scattered settlements. They were connected societies, buzzing with new ideas. In taverns, churches, and town halls, people were asking a dangerous question. How long can a free people live under the rule of a distant king? Parliament, blind to the growing storm, passed the Tea Act. It was a law designed to save the struggling British East India Company by letting it sell tea directly to the colonies. To London, it was smart business. To America, it was tyranny, enforcing a tax they had long rejected. Soon, tea ships arrived in colonial harbors. In New York and Philadelphia, angry citizens forced them to turn back. But in Boston, Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to yield. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver sat anchored in the harbor, a floating symbol of British control. Then came the night of December 16, 1773. A bitter wind swept through Boston as thousands gathered. At the Old South Meeting House, their anger boiled over. When no resolution came, a cry rose from the crowd, "Boston Harbor a teapot tonight." Under the cover of darkness, members of the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawk warriors, moved silently to Worth Griffin's Wharf. With quiet determination, they boarded the 3 ships. For hours, the only sounds were the smashing of wooden crates and the splash of tea into the icy harbor. In total, 342 chests of tea were destroyed. There was no chaos, no theft, only a solemn, unified act of defiance. By dawn, the harbor was a floating sea of tea, stained black. When word reached London, Parliament was furious. This wasn't protest, it was rebellion. Their response was swift and harsh. In 1774, they passed what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Boston's harbor was closed. The colonial government was dissolved and replaced with royal appointees. British troops could now be quartered in private homes. These laws were meant to crush Boston's spirit, but they did the opposite. They united the colonies. Food and supplies poured into the blockaded city from across the continent. What had been Massachusetts's struggle was now America's struggle. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. George Washington, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, the greatest minds in America, gathered to debate their next move. After weeks of fierce discussion, they agreed to stand together. They condemned Britain's actions, called for a complete boycott of British goods, and sent a final petition to King George III. But beneath the formal words was a clear message. If diplomacy failed, they were prepared to fight. As the Congress concluded, Patrick Henry's voice rang out, defining the moment. The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. Across the colonies, the people began to prepare. Militias drilled openly in town squares, calling themselves Minutemen, ready to fight at a moment's notice. Muskets were cleaned and powder was stockpiled. In Boston, General Thomas Gage tightened his grip, but the spirit of resistance only grew stronger. Pamphlets and sermons spread the language of liberty like wildfire. In Virginia, Patrick Henry delivered a speech that would electrify the colonies and seal the nation's fate. Gentlemen may cry, "Peace, peace," but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Those words became a rallying cry from Massachusetts to Georgia. By the spring of 1775, the king had dismissed their petitions and ordered his troops to disarm the colonists. But it was too late. In April, British soldiers marched out of Boston under the cover of darkness, their destination, Concord, where the rebels' weapons were hidden. But riders like Paul Revere were already galloping through the countryside, spreading the alarm. The lanterns hung in the Old North Church, 1, if by land, 2, if by sea, had signaled the advance. Across the land, church bells rang out. Farmers and tradesmen grabbed their muskets and gathered on their village greens. The time for petitions and protests was over. The tea had been spilled. Now, the fire would begin. Spring, 1775. Massachusetts, the air was crisp, the trees budding green after a long, hard winter. But beneath this calm, tension was coiled like a drawn bow. Boston was an occupied city. Red-coated British soldiers patrolled its narrow streets, their bayonets glinting in the sun. Beyond the city, in villages and farms, thousands of colonists, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers waited, armed and ready. They knew the peace couldn't last. The British government had declared the colonies in open rebellion, and General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in Boston, was ordered to seize their weapons and arrest their leaders. Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The night of April 18th was still and moonless. General Gage's plan went into motion. 800 of the world's finest soldiers marched out of Boston toward Lexington and Concord. Their mission: confiscate hidden munitions and capture the rebellion's leaders. But Boston was alive with spies. Word spread quickly. Watching from the shadows, Paul Revere and William Dawes mounted their horses. From the steeple of the Old North Church to lanterns flashed the signal. The British were crossing the Charles River. As the troops moved silently, Revere rode hard into the night, his voice echoing through every village. The regulars are coming out. Church bells clanged. Men grabbed their muskets. The alarm spread like wildfire. By dawn, the weary British troops reached Lexington. On the village green, 77 local militiamen stood waiting, commanded by Captain John Parker. Outnumbered, they formed a thin line. A British major rode forward, shouting for them to disperse. Parker gave a simple order: stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then, a single shot, no one knows from where. That one crack split history in two. The British line erupted in gunfire. Smoke filled the air. When it cleared, 8 colonists lay dead. The first blood of the American Revolution had been spilled. The soldiers marched on to Concord, but found few weapons. The Patriots had already hidden them. As they searched, hundreds of armed colonists gathered on the ridges outside town. At the Old North Bridge, the two forces faced off again. This time, both sides fired. The redcoats retreated. Farmers and laborers had stood their ground against the mighty British army and won. The retreat to Boston became a nightmare for the British. From behind every wall, every tree, the militia struck. Musket fire flashed from the forests. By the time the British column reached safety, more than 250 of their men were dead or wounded. The colonists lost fewer than 100. The rebellion was alive. Within days, nearly 20,000 militiamen from every colony surrounded Boston, cutting off the British garrison. The siege of Boston had begun. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened. Among the delegates was a tall, quiet Virginian, George Washington. Dressed in his old uniform, his presence spoke volumes. Congress unanimously appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the new Continental Army. 13 scattered colonies, with no flag, no navy, and no formal army, were now ready to face the most powerful empire on earth. The first great test came on June 17, 1775, at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The colonial commander's order became legend. "Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Though the Patriots were eventually forced to retreat, the British suffered over 1,000 casualties. The colonists had proven that courage could stand against an empire. The shot heard round the world, fired on that village green in Lexington, was more than the start of a war. It was the sound of an idea taking form that ordinary people could rise against tyranny, that liberty was worth fighting for. The time for hesitation was over. The colonies no longer spoke of loyalty. They spoke of independence. And from that fire, the United States of America would be forged. The year 1776 dawned with the thunder of war echoing across the colonies. From the rocky hills of Massachusetts to the fields of Virginia, the American Revolution was no longer just an idea. It was a living reality, forged in smoke, blood, and defiance. The people had taken up arms not merely against soldiers, but against an empire. Boston remained under siege. Thousands of colonial militiamen encircled the city, while inside, British General William Howe's redcoats endured hunger and disease. This ragtag rebellion was becoming an organized army, and at its head now stood a man destined to shape a nation, George Washington. When Washington took command of the Continental Army, he found a disorganized collection of farmers, fishermen, and tradesmen. Many had no uniforms, few had training, and supplies were scarce. Yet within this disorder, Washington saw an unbreakable spirit that could be molded into a force worthy of freedom. Tall and solemn, he led by example, drilling his troops daily and instilling unity among men from separate colonies. The siege of Boston tightened. Cannons, captured from Fort Ticonderoga, were hauled over frozen mountains in a remarkable feat of endurance. By March 1776, those guns were positioned on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city. Realizing they were trapped, the British evacuated Boston. The city that had kindled rebellion was free. This victory electrified the colonies. For the first time, people began to believe they could actually win. That same winter, Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, struck the colonies like lightning. Written in plain, forceful language, it argued that monarchy was tyranny, and that America must break free. "'Tis time to part," Paine declared. "The cause of America is, in great measure, the cause of all mankind." Within weeks, more than 100,000 copies circulated, giving voice to what many already felt but feared to say. The fight was not for reform, but for independence. That summer, in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened. In June, a committee was appointed to draft a formal declaration. Among them was a quiet, 33-year-old Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. He wrote through the night, his quill scratching under candlelight. His words were simple yet immortal. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted for independence. 2 days later, they approved Jefferson's document, the Declaration of Independence. As the words were read aloud, church bells rang and cannons thundered. For the first time, the 13 colonies called themselves the United States of America. Across the ocean, King George III read the declaration with cold fury. It was treason. He ordered more troops, more ships, more war. The empire would not lose its colonies without a fight. And that fight came swiftly. In July, a massive British fleet appeared off New York, the largest ever assembled at that time, with over 30,000 men. Against them, Washington could muster fewer than half that number, most untrained and ill-equipped. On August 27th, the British struck at Long Island. It was Washington's first true test, and it ended in disaster. The Continental Army barely escaped annihilation, saved only by a daring nighttime retreat across the East River. Over the next months, the Americans were driven from New York and pursued across New Jersey. By December, the revolution seemed doomed. Soldiers deserted, enlistments expired, and the dream of independence hung by a thread. But Washington refused to surrender. On Christmas night, 1776, as icy winds howled, he led 2,400 men across the frozen Delaware River. At Trenton, they surprised a garrison of Hessian mercenaries. The Americans struck swiftly, capturing nearly 1,000 prisoners. Days later, they won another victory at Princeton. These small triumphs revived the Revolution. Hope returned. Washington's army had proven it could fight and win. As 1777 dawned, the war entered a new phase. The struggle was no longer for protest or survival. It was for nationhood. The Declaration had transformed rebels into revolutionaries, subjects into citizens. The world had watched America rise in defiance. Now it would watch to see if she could stand. The die was cast. The colonies had declared themselves free. Now they would have to prove it. The year is 1777. The ink on the Declaration of Independence is barely dry. But the dream it represents is already on the verge of collapse. The Continental Army, led by a beleaguered George Washington, is a shadow of itself, battered, starving, and on the run. The British have seized New York, the economic heart of the colonies, and now they have a brilliant plan to sever New England from the rest, crushing the rebellion once and for all. It's a strategy that looks flawless on paper. But, as history shows us, maps are not the territory, and plans often die in the mud and blood of reality. Washington knows he can't win a straight fight. His army isn't built to conquer. It's built to endure. He adopts a strategy of harassment, of quick strikes and ghost-like disappearances into the forests. While the British march on Philadelphia, America's capital, Washington makes his stand at Brandywine Creek. The battle is a brutal, chaotic affair. Despite their courage, the Americans are outmaneuvered and forced to retreat. The British march into Philadelphia, and the Continental Congress flees. For the American cause, it feels like the beginning of the end. As winter descends, Washington leads his broken army to a place that will become legendary: Valley Forge. It is a name synonymous with suffering. Soldiers, many barefoot, leave trails of blood in the snow. They build crude huts to fend off the brutal cold. Here, in this crucible of despair, more men die from disease, hunger, and exposure than in any battle. It is the army's darkest hour. Yet, In the midst of this unimaginable hardship, something extraordinary happens. A Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, arrives. He doesn't bring gold or supplies, but something far more valuable: discipline. Cursing in broken English, he tirelessly drills the starving, frozen men, transforming them from a ragtag militia into a professional fighting force. At the same time, hundreds of miles north, a stunning victory changes everything. At Saratoga, the Americans, against all odds, force the surrender of an entire British army under General Burgoyne. The news of Saratoga electrifies the world. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin's patient diplomacy finally pays off. Seeing that the Americans can actually win, King Louis XVI of France officially recognizes the United States and joins the war as an ally. Suddenly, this isn't just a colonial rebellion. It's a global conflict. Ships, soldiers, and money will now flow from Europe to aid the American cause. But the war is far from over. The army that emerges from Valley Forge is a new entity, hardened, disciplined, and unified by shared suffering. They prove their mettle at the Battle of Monmouth, fighting the British to a standstill under a scorching sun, with Washington himself rallying his men on the front lines. The Revolution has become a war of endurance, even as it faces betrayal from within, with the defection of one of its greatest heroes. Benedict Arnold, the spirit of the people, refuses to break. By 1780, the American Revolution was stuck. 5 years of brutal fighting had left the Continental Army in tatters. Soldiers, unpaid and starving, fought barefoot, their morale crumbling. The dream of independence was fading. Even with allies like France and Spain, the United States was facing its darkest hour. The British, sensing weakness, shifted their strategy south. They believed the southern colonies were filled with loyalists just waiting to rejoin the crown. Their plan was simple: capture the ports, rally loyalist support, and strangle the rebellion from below. In May 1780, they dealt a crippling blow. Charleston, South Carolina, fell, and over 5,000 American soldiers were captured, one of the worst defeats of the war. British General Cornwallis pushed inland, confident he could crush what was left of the American spirit. But the South wasn't the loyalist stronghold London had imagined. Instead, the British walked into a hornet's nest of guerrilla warfare. In the swamps and forests of the Carolinas, men like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, led small, elusive bands of fighters. They struck without warning and vanished into the wilderness, bleeding the British army death by 1,000 cuts. Out of this chaos, a new American commander, Nathaniel Greene, rose to the challenge. He didn't have to win every battle. He just had to survive. "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again," he wrote, masterfully wearing down Cornwallis's army. Then came the turning points. At Kings Mountain, frontier riflemen wiped out a loyalist force. At Cowpens, General Daniel Morgan executed a brilliant trap, delivering a humiliating defeat to the British. For the first time in years, a glimmer of hope returned. Meanwhile, in the north, Washington was barely holding his army together, facing mutinies over lack of pay and food. He knew time was running out. America needed one decisive, war-ending victory. That opportunity was about to present itself in a small Virginia port town called Yorktown. By the summer of 1781, Cornwallis had marched his exhausted army to Yorktown, planning to rest and resupply. Washington saw his opening. In a stroke of strategic genius, he coordinated with the French army and navy, while tricking the British in New York into thinking he was preparing an attack there. Washington secretly marched his entire army over 400 miles south. By September, the trap was set. The French fleet blocked the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off any escape by sea. On land, The combined American and French armies surrounded Cornwallis completely. The siege began. For 3 relentless weeks, Allied cannons pounded the British positions day and night. On October 14th, American and French troops stormed the outer defenses. A young officer named Alexander Hamilton led a daring nighttime bayonet charge, capturing a key position in minutes. The British defences crumbled. 2 days later, with no hope left, General Cornwallis requested terms of surrender. On October 19, 1781, nearly 8,000 British soldiers marched out of Yorktown and laid down their arms. Legend says their bands played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," and it had. The news ignited celebrations across the colonies. Church bells rang for hours. The impossible had happened. A fledgling nation of farmers had defeated the mightiest empire on earth. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially recognizing the United States of America as a free and independent nation. The war was won. But George Washington's greatest test of leadership was yet to come. With his officers on the brink of mutiny over unpaid wages, some whispered of making him a king. Washington rejected the notion with powerful humility, urging them to finish the great work they had started. On December 23, 1783, he did something truly revolutionary. He resigned his command and returned to his farm, a private citizen. He had been given ultimate power and had willingly given it back. The revolution had turned the tide of history. But, as the smoke cleared, a new, even greater challenge lay ahead. The war for independence was over. The struggle to build a nation was just beginning. The guns of the American Revolution had finally gone silent. After 8 long, brutal years, the impossible had happened. The American colonies had defeated the most powerful empire on earth. The 1783 Treaty of Paris made it official. Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America. But winning the war was just the opening act. The real battle, the struggle for unity, stability, and a national identity, was only just beginning. The war had left the new nation in shambles. Cities were scarred, farms were burned to the ground, and trade was completely shattered. Inflation was out of control, and the government was bankrupt. The Continental Army, unpaid and disbanded, went home to neglected farms and workshops. Thousands of widows and orphans were left to mourn the staggering cost of liberty. And yet, in this moment of exhaustion and uncertainty, a sense of awe swept over the people. They had done what no colony in history had ever done before. They had thrown off the chains of empire and stood alone. But freedom, as George Washington knew all too well, doesn't sustain itself. Without order and unity, liberty can quickly spiral into chaos. The nation's first government, the Articles of Confederation, was a fragile experiment. It bound the 13 states together in name only, giving the central government almost no real power. Congress couldn't raise taxes, enforce laws, or regulate trade. Each state acted like its own little country, printing its own money and setting its own rules. At first, this seemed to honor the Revolution's spirit of independence. But soon, it became terrifyingly clear that the system was broken. The new republic was adrift, a collection of states, not a united nation. By the mid-1780s, discontent was boiling over. In Massachusetts, debt-ridden farmers, led by a former Revolutionary War captain named Daniel Shays, rose up in rebellion. They shut down courts and marched on the state arsenal, demanding relief. The rebellion was crushed, but it sent shockwaves across the country. To many leaders, it was a grim warning. Liberty without structure was just another word for anarchy. George Washington, watching from his retirement at Mount Vernon, was deeply worried. "What is to become of our government?" He wrote, "If we cannot make it respectable abroad and secure at home." The call went out. In 1787, 55 delegates from every state gathered in Philadelphia. Their goal was simple: to fix the Articles of Confederation. But what emerged from that sweltering summer would change the world forever. The Constitutional Convention opened in the very same hall where independence had been declared. The air was thick with heat and anticipation. To ensure secrecy, the windows were sealed shut and guards stood at the doors. Inside, men like James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton, with Washington presiding, set about forging a new government from scratch. The debates were fierce. They argued over the balance of power between large and small states, between the government and the people, and between liberty and order. James Madison, just 36 years old, became the intellectual architect of the new Constitution. He envisioned a system built not on trust, but on checks and balances, a government strong enough to lead, yet limited enough to protect freedom. The deadlock between large and small states was broken by a great compromise, a two-house legislature, with a House of Representatives based on population and a Senate with equal representation for every state. But another compromise was far darker. To keep the southern states in the Union, the delegates agreed to the infamous Three-Fifths Compromise, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation. It was a moral wound that would fester for generations. Finally, on September 17, 1787, the Constitution of the United States was signed. A frail, 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin looked at the sun carved into Washington's chair and said, "I have often wondered whether that sun was rising or setting. But now I know it is a rising sun." The document was revolutionary. It established a government of the people, creating a president, a Congress, and a Supreme Court. But it wasn't a done deal. Across the states, fierce debates erupted. Federalists like Hamilton and Madison argued for a strong central government, while anti-federalists feared tyranny and demanded a Bill of Rights. To win support, Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers, a brilliant defense of the Constitution. Eventually, with the promise of a Bill of Rights, the Constitution was ratified. In 1789, the new government took effect. George Washington, called from retirement once more, traveled to New York City. On April 30th, standing on the balcony of Federal Hall, he took the oath of office as the first president. Cannons boomed. Bells rang. The American experiment had become a reality. From the smoke of war and the courage of ordinary people, a nation had been born, imperfect, fragile, but free. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the story of democracy itself. Imagine this: a brand new nation, full of ambition and promise, has just navigated a peaceful change in leadership. When Thomas Jefferson took office after John Adams, it wasn't with conflict, but with cooperation. This was a huge deal. It proved to the world, and to Americans themselves, that democracy could work through calm transitions. President Jefferson had a grand vision for America. He imagined a republic built not on aristocracy, but on the strength of its people, the farmers, the merchants, the builders. He believed in a society guided by knowledge and equality. Under his leadership, the government aimed for simplicity. They cut spending, lowered the national debt, and championed individual freedom. A spirit of optimism was sweeping across the land as the nation's core institutions began to solidify. Then, in 1803, came a moment that would change America forever: the Louisiana Purchase. With a single, masterful agreement with France, the United States nearly doubled in size overnight. Suddenly, vast, uncharted territories west of the Mississippi River belonged to the Republic. But what was actually out there? To find out, Jefferson commissioned one of the greatest adventures in American history, the Lewis and Clark expedition. Starting in 1804, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led their cause of discovery from St. Louis all the way to the Pacific Ocean and back. Their journey was incredible. They documented new rivers, mountains, plants, and animals, and crucially, they connected with numerous indigenous communities whose knowledge and help were essential for their survival and success. This expedition didn't just map the land. It opened the American imagination to the sheer scale and possibility of the continent. As settlers moved westward, new states began joining the Union. Farms and towns sprang up, connected by a growing network of roads and rivers. A shared American identity was beginning to form. But this rapid expansion wasn't without its challenges. The nation was a melting pot of different peoples and cultures. Tough questions arose. How should these new territories be governed? What were the rights of everyone living on the frontier? The government had to find a delicate balance between encouraging growth and ensuring fairness for all. At the same time, the U.S. was finding its place on the world stage. Trade was vital, but European conflicts often spilled over onto the high seas, threatening American ships. Instead of rushing into war, Jefferson chose diplomacy and patience, setting a precedent for how the young nation would handle foreign affairs. Back home, a cultural blossoming was underway. Writers, inventors, and reformers were shaping what it meant to be American. New schools and universities opened their doors, and a lively press connected distant communities, sparking national conversations about the country's future. Innovation was everywhere, with new machines transforming both farms and factories. After 2 terms, Jefferson stepped down, honoring the tradition of limited presidential power and ensuring another peaceful transition. The presidents who followed, like James Madison and James Monroe, continued the work of building the nation and defining its role in the world. By the early 1800s, the United States was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a functioning republic, guided by a flexible constitution that could adapt to growth and disagreement. Of course, the promise of equality for all was still a work in progress, a challenge the nation would continue to wrestle with for generations. But the foundation was solid. These first decades were years of exploration, learning, and steady progress. It was a time defined not by being perfect, but by being full of possibility. The nation had taken its first steps, guided by determination and hope, the very values that would continue to shape its incredible journey.